return of peace after the world's most devastating war. VJ Day, victory in the second half of the global conflict. Japan has surrendered, and there's jubilation around this earth. The Japs began it by sending those warships to launch their bombers against Pearl Harbor. The motion pictures the Japs proudly displayed, pictures of the sneak attack on the day that will live in infamy. While talking peace, they bombed American warships in the harbor. Treachery was the Japanese declaration of war. Before Congress, President Roosevelt called upon America to accept the challenge of war.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Seizing American islands, the Japs took wake and captured Guam, thrusting in mid-Pacific and along the Asiatic mainland. The rampaging enemy in a sweep of conquest, a major goal being Singapore. The aircraft carrier Hornet, Americans feeling they must strike back. Jimmy Doolittle leads bombers against Tokyo. The task force is commanded by Admiral Halsey in a dash toward the coast of Japan where the planes take off. The Doolittle bombing of Tokyo early in the war displayed the spirit of half-armed America. This was a small foreshadowing of the giant air fleets that were later to assail Japan, and Tokyo got its first bombing. In the East Indies, the tide of Jap conquest swept on, and no wonder the enemy, intoxicated by success, thought he was invincible. The world wondered, could the Jap be stopped? The Philippines conquered, American troops overwhelmed by numbers. MacArthur called to Australia to take the Allied command. The end came when the exhausted forces of General Wainwright were compelled to surrender, and the depth of Japanese barbarity was shown in the infamous Death March of Bataan. This enraged Americans more than any other atrocity of the Japs. The enemy swept all the way into the Solomon Islands. Dark days for our side. The stolen empire of the Jap was at its greatest extent. Vast potential wealth and power. America was mobilizing meanwhile. All the mighty resources of the greatest industrial nation were dedicated to war. The invasion of Guadalcanal was the first American offensive in the Pacific. For the first time, the Japs lost ground. The American flag pushed forward. The offensive up the line of the Solomon Islands. The tide of Japanese conquest was reversed, and from now on, the Allies swept forward into New Guinea. Paratroop invasion of New Guinea, soldiers of the sky. And in command of Americans and Australians, General MacArthur. The sweep along the New Guinea coast with amphibious hops, a dominating feature in the reconquest of the southwestern Pacific. And in the central Pacific, Tarawa in the Gilberts. The invasion of Tarawa with heavy losses in the landings was an epic of Marine Corps heroism, and combat cameramen filmed graphic scenes of the tense deadliness of the fighting. The drive through the Central Pacific to Saipan and Guam. Guam, the American-owned island seized by the Japs, was now retaken. So the Stars and Stripes flew on Guam again, which became a great base for bombing Japan. And Guam was headquarters for Admiral Nimitz. Palau was the stepping stone to the Philippines. General MacArthur, landing on Leyte with Philippine President Osmeña, fulfilled his pledge, "I shall return." The Japanese fleet came out for battle, seeking to break up the American invasion of the Philippines, and was so badly defeated that it never was an effective naval force again. An invasion fleet swings through the inland sea for the climax of the reconquest of the Philippines, landings on Lingayen Gulf, and then on to Manila. The city burning, Manila wantonly put to the torch by the Japs, and bitter fighting in the streets. Corregidor invaded by air, the famous rock in Manila Harbor, and there MacArthur, on historic ground and sacred for Americans, orders the flag raised. The drive to that island was a thrust at Japan itself. Iwo Jima, dominated by the volcano Mount Suribachi. A few hundred miles from the coast of Japan, the Iwo Jima invasion brought on one of the bitterest of battles. The Japs resisted fiercely, that island being a bombing base so near to their country. But Iwo was conquered, the site of that famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi. The Okinawa invasion, which was featured by Jap suicide air attacks, desperately trying to block the American conquest of the island at the doorstep of Japan, the kamikazes tried to crash their bomb-loaded planes right into American warships. Most attempts failed, many in episodes of dramatic thrill. Some kamikazes got through and heavy damage was done to American warships. But the conquest of Okinawa went on relentlessly. The nearest base from which to bomb Japan was occupied in flaming battle. The capture of Okinawa completed the series of bases from which Japan was assailed by the devastation of bombs, with the cataclysm of the atomic bomb, Soviet Russia entering the war, completing the encirclement of Japan. President Truman gave warning that Japan would be obliterated by atomic bombs, and Japan surrendered, which completes the victory in the global war. The Japs conspired with Nazi Germany to wage a war of conquest. In Europe, the power of the Nazis was crushed, and now soon afterward, Japan quits in the Pacific. The second half of the most frightful of all wars ends in America's greatest victory.